What you're watching right now is not just a war, it's the clearest signal yet that the old world order is being renegotiated in real time, one missile at a time. On April 25th, Russia's Ministry of Defense confirmed that its forces delivered strikes across 148 separate areas in a single day, employing operational tactical aviation, attack drones, missile troops, and artillery against Ukrainian troop positions and foreign mercenaries throughout the country. 148. Let that sink in for a moment. That's not a battlefield skirmish. That's not a localized exchange of fire. That is a coordinated, multi layered military operation of staggering scale executed across an entire country inside 24 hours. And here's what the headlines won't tell you. What this number actually reveals isn't just military capability, it reveals a geopolitical calculation. It reveals a message being sent, not only to Kiev, but to Washington, to Brussels, and frankly to every American sitting at home wondering what on earth is happening over there and why it should matter to them. Because it does matter. The shape of the world you're going to live in for the next 20 or 30 years is being determined right now in the smoldering cities of eastern Ukraine. The question is whether you're reading the map correctly or whether you're trusting people who have every incentive to hand you a distorted one. So let's actually look at the map together and let's talk about what's really going on. The first thing you have to understand is the context in which this 148 target strike day is happening, because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. The United States-led diplomatic efforts to end this war continue to stall, even as both sides recently observed a brief 32-hour Orthodox Easter ceasefire. That truce, predictably, fell apart almost immediately. By 7 in the morning on April 12th, Ukraine's military had recorded 2,299 ceasefire violations, while Russia's Ministry of Defense countered by accusing Ukrainian forces of nearly 2,000 breaches of their own. So you have a 32-hour ceasefire that both sides walked away from, claiming the other side broke it thousands of times. And then, less than 2 weeks later, you have Russia executing strikes across 148 locations in one day. This is not the behavior of a party that is moving toward peace. This is the behavior of a party that has made a calculation, a cold, strategic calculation, that the battlefield, not the negotiating table, is where this war will ultimately be decided. Now, I want you to think about that carefully, because there's a very seductive narrative circulating in Western media, particularly in American media, that says Russia is weakening, that sanctions are working, that the Russian economy is collapsing, and that all we need to do is hold on a little longer and the pressure will eventually force Putin's hand. That narrative is comforting. It is also, when you look at the actual data, deeply misleading. Russia's actual defense spending, including classified expenditures, likely reached around 7.3% of GDP in 2025, which translates to roughly 15.86 trillion rubles, well above what the Kremlin officially publishes in its budget figures. When a government is spending that proportion of its entire economic output on warfare while simultaneously running deficits and hiking taxes on its own citizens, that is not the behavior of a government that thinks it's losing. That is the behavior of a government that has made an all-in strategic bet and is prepared to absorb enormous domestic pain to see it through. To sustain the current war effort, Russia must send an additional 30,000 able-bodied, working-age men to the front each month. Think about what that means for a country of roughly 144 million people. That is a level of human sacrifice that would be politically catastrophic in any Western democracy within months. And yet in Russia, it continues, month after month, year after year, now well into the fifth year of this war. Why? Because the Kremlin has constructed a political environment in which dissent is suppressed, information is controlled, and the populations in poorer Russian regions have been economically co-opted through army recruitment payments and compensation for fallen soldiers. In some cases, the war has actually served as an economic equalizer for Russia's poorer regions, injecting cash through army recruitment and casualty payments, a deeply tragic reality where the cost of a son's life becomes a financial lifeline for a struggling family. That is how authoritarian systems sustain wars that democracies would have long since ended, and it tells you something essential about what we are actually dealing with here. Now let's talk about the peace process, because the Trump administration came in promising to end this war fast. You'll remember the optimism, the claims that a deal could be reached within 24 hours, within 100 days. U.S. diplomatic efforts have so far not achieved the results that President Trump initially hoped for, and in mid-April, both Secretary of State Marco Rubio and President Trump indicated that the U.S. was ready to walk away from the peace process unless significant progress is made. Walking away. That phrase should be reverberating in every foreign policy conversation happening in America right now. Because what does it mean for the United States to walk away from the only active diplomatic effort aimed at ending the largest land war in Europe since World War II? It means the war continues. It means Ukraine continues to bleed. It means Russia continues to strike 148 locations in a single day. And it means the European continent continues to sit on a knife's edge of potential escalation that nobody in Washington seems to want to have an honest conversation about. Trump's administration formulated peace plans generally favorable towards Russia, but these offers have been met with refusal from both Russia and Ukraine. Read that again. Both sides refused. Ukraine refused because it doesn't want to legitimize territorial losses. Russia refused because it doesn't believe it needs to accept anything short of full capitulation by Kyiv. And the United States finds itself in the peculiar position of being the self-appointed mediator that neither party trusts or respects enough to follow. And that is a profoundly unstable diplomatic situation. It's not a peace process. It's a performance of a peace process. And while the performance is playing out on the diplomatic stage, the real action, the action that will actually determine the outcome, is happening on the ground, in the trenches of Donetsk, in the skies over Dnipro, across 148 target locations in a single April day. Let me be very clear about something that tends to get lost in the noise. Russia's recent overnight attacks across 8 regions of Ukraine in a single period killed at least 8 people in Dnipro alone, with 49 others wounded, including 2 children, while strikes hit the Zaporizhia region, Chernihiv, and several other areas across the country. These are human beings. Real people with families, with futures, who were simply living their lives when the strikes came. But we have to look beyond the immediate human tragedy, as devastating as it is, and understand what the pattern of these strikes tells us. Russia is not targeting only military installations. It is targeting the infrastructure that holds a society together: the power plants, the ports, the heating systems, the apartment buildings where ordinary civilians sleep. The confirmed Russian strike on April 25th included attacks on defense industry targets, fuel and oil facilities, power enterprises, and port infrastructure that supports the Ukrainian armed forces, port infrastructure, energy infrastructure, industrial capacity. These are not tactical military strikes. These are strategic strikes aimed at breaking the economic and social backbone of a country. That distinction matters enormously for how we understand what Russia's actual war aims are. Russia's goal has never simply been to capture territory. Russia's goal, if you read Putin's own words carefully, if you look at the pattern of what Russia actually does versus what it says at diplomatic tables, is to make Ukraine ungovernable, to make the cost of resistance so unbearable, the cold winters, the rolling blackouts, the shattered apartment buildings, the relentless economic erosion, that the Ukrainian people themselves begin to question whether continued resistance is worth the price. It is a strategy of exhaustion directed at a civilian population, and it has been running without interruption for over 4 years now. Here's where the geopolitical picture gets particularly interesting for an American audience, because this war is not happening in isolation from everything else going on in the world. Ukraine has damaged or destroyed a significant amount of Russian oil and gas infrastructure over recent weeks, which prompted Russia to issue a formal warning to European countries against funding Ukraine's long-range drone production, claiming that such moves are deliberately escalating the military and political situation across the European continent. Russia is now warning Europe, not just Ukraine, Europe. Russia is explicitly saying that European nations, which support Ukraine's ability to strike Russian territory, are making themselves parties to the conflict. Now, from a strict reading of international law, that is almost certainly not true. But the geopolitical psychology of that threat matters enormously. It is designed to make European governments hesitate, to make Brussels calculate the cost of continued support, to make ordinary European citizens wonder whether their governments are dragging them into a war they never voted for. And to some extent, it's working, because European unity on Ukraine, while still largely intact, is under constant strain. Meanwhile, let's talk about what the Russian economy is actually telling us, because this is where the longer-term picture becomes genuinely fascinating. Russia is likely to slide from a phase of managed cooling into outright stagnation in 2026, with any meaningful recovery unlikely before 2027 as Western sanctions tighten and military demands on the budget show little sign of easing. The wartime sugar rush that Russia experienced in 2023 and 2024, driven by massive state military spending injecting cash into the economy, is fading. Defense outlays now represent over 40% of the federal budget, a historic high, and compared with 2023, military spending has risen by 31%, meaning roughly 1 ruble out of every 2 in tax revenue is now allocated to military purposes. That is an extraordinary figure. 40% of a national budget going to defense and war. That is the economic profile not of a confident great power consolidating its position, but of a state that has committed so deeply to a military gamble that it cannot afford to stop without the whole edifice collapsing. The first quarter of 2026 officially registered a contraction of the Russian economy, which is the strategic center of gravity in this war of attrition. Contraction, not slowdown, not reduced growth. Actual economic shrinkage. And the key phrase there is war of attrition, because that is ultimately the framework within which everything else has to be understood. This is not a war that will be won or lost in a single dramatic military breakthrough. It is a grinding, year-by-year contest of which side can absorb pain longer, which side has the deeper reserves of political will, economic capacity, and social cohesion to outlast the other. And when you frame it that way, a few things become very clear that mainstream commentary tends to obscure. The Russian spring offensive in Donbass has yielded no territorial gains amid heavy casualties, recruitment shortfalls, and rising financial strain. Russia is throwing enormous resources at the front lines and achieving very little in terms of territorial advance. The 148 target strike day is in part a reflection of this frustration. When you can advance on the ground, you escalate from the air. When tactical military operations stall, you reach for strategic bombardment. And that pattern of behavior, historically, has often been a sign not of strength, but of a military machine that has exhausted its options for conventional battlefield success. The main cause of this transformation of the battlefield is the new edge Ukraine has gained in drone warfare by combining saturation of the tactical zone with first-person view drones and mid-range strikes so that the effective kill zone is expanded to some 120 kilometers from the front lines. This is the technological story that is not being told loudly enough in Western media. Ukraine has become extraordinarily sophisticated in its drone operations. It is striking Russian oil refineries deep inside Russian territory. It is disrupting Russian logistics. It is making the cost of every Russian advance dramatically higher in terms of men and equipment. And this is happening at a time when Russia is already struggling with recruitment shortfalls and a contracting economy. These trends don't reverse easily or quickly, but, and this is the critical but, none of this guarantees a Ukrainian victory or even a durable ceasefire in any foreseeable time frame. As of late April 2026, market prediction odds on a Russia-Ukraine ceasefire by April 30th sit at just 0.5%, reflecting entrenched, divergent demands and the absence of any breakthrough since the short-lived Easter truce, with ongoing military actions underscoring persistent escalation signals, 0.5%. That is how confident informed observers are that any formal cessation of hostilities is coming soon. The gap between the two sides remains enormous. Ukraine has proposed freezing the conflict along the current front lines, but Russia has rejected this, demanding instead that Ukraine surrender all territory in the Donetsk region it currently controls, a demand Kiev calls unacceptable. There is no diplomatic middle ground visible from where things stand today, and that brings us back to those 148 strikes, because here's what that number ultimately represents in the broader strategic picture. It represents a Russian government that has made a political and military calculation that time, pain, and attrition are on its side, that the United States under Trump will eventually lose patience and disengage from the process. that European unity will slowly fracture under economic and political pressure, that Ukrainian society, no matter how resilient and admirable its resistance has been, cannot indefinitely sustain the human and economic toll of defending against a nuclear-armed neighbor that is willing to turn over 40% of its national budget to the war effort year after year. That is the Kremlin's bet. And whether you think it's a good bet or a terrible bet, you have to acknowledge that it is a coherent, strategically rational bet from Moscow's perspective. It is not the bet of a government that believes it's losing. What this means for Americans is something that deserves far more honest conversation than it's getting. The decisions made in Washington over the next 12 to 18 months about whether to maintain support for Ukraine, about what the terms of any eventual settlement look like, about whether NATO's credibility as a deterrent is preserved or eroded, will shape the security architecture of Europe for a generation. Russia has insisted there can be no ceasefire until a comprehensive settlement is agreed, and Russian President Vladimir Putin has ruled out any deployment of troops from NATO countries on Ukrainian soil. Those are not negotiating positions. Those are strategic demands that, if accepted, would fundamentally alter the balance of power on the European continent in ways that would take decades to reverse. The 148 strikes are Russia saying loudly and clearly, through the language that authoritarian states use most fluently, the language of force, that it intends to win this on its own terms, regardless of what the diplomats are discussing in their conference rooms. And so the question that you, sitting in America, need to be asking yourself is not the question the mainstream media keeps posing, which is essentially, how do we get to a ceasefire as quickly as possible? The more important and harder question is, what kind of world do we want to live in after this war ends? Because the way this war ends will determine the answer to that question in ways that go far beyond Ukraine's borders. If Russia successfully extracts a settlement that rewards 4 years of systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure, territorial annexation through military force, and the deliberate targeting of a democratic neighbor's society, then the message sent to every authoritarian government watching from Beijing to Tehran is unmistakable. That message is, it works, force works, patience works, exhausting the Western democracy's attention spans works. And once that message is credibly established, the world becomes a fundamentally more dangerous place for everyone, including every American who never gave Ukraine a second thought. The 148 targets struck in a single day are not a number, they're a statement. And understanding exactly what that statement means, who it's directed at, what it's designed to achieve, and what it reveals about the deeper strategic logic of the people making these decisions is the beginning of actually understanding the world we live in.